December 8, 1940. Winston Churchill sits alone in his study at Chequers, writing the most desperate letter of his career. Britain has been at war for 15 months. The treasury is almost empty. The Luftwaffe has turned London into rubble. And the most powerful nation on earth refuses to help. Churchill's 4,000-word plea to Franklin Roosevelt would later be called one of the most important letters in history. In it, Britain's Prime Minister essentially admits his nation is bankrupt. The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. He was begging America to save Britain. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Roosevelt's response would cost Britain something far more valuable than money. What happened next would end the largest empire in human history. To understand how the greatest empire ever assembled essentially signed its own death warrant, we need to go back to September 1939, when Britain declared war on Nazi Germany. At that moment, the British Empire controlled roughly 1/4 of the Earth's land surface. 400 million people lived under the Union Jack. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency, and London was the undisputed financial capital of the planet. But there was a problem, a devastating one. Britain had never fully recovered from the First World War. That conflict had transformed Britain from the world's largest creditor nation into a debtor. The national debt had multiplied 12-fold between 1914 and 1918. 20 years later, Britain was entering another existential war with an economy still carrying those scars. And this time, Britain couldn't count on American help. At least not at first. You see, the American public wanted nothing to do with another European war. The Neutrality Acts passed by Congress in the 1930s made it illegal for the United States to sell weapons to warring nations on credit. If Britain wanted American planes, tanks, and ammunition, they would have to pay cash. And they would have to carry those goods away on their own ships. Cash and carry. That was the rule. Roosevelt sympathized with Britain. He genuinely wanted to help. But his hands were tied by law and public opinion. So he told Churchill the same thing a banker tells a customer with bad credit. Show me the money first. What followed was the most spectacular liquidation sale in economic history. The British government began by spending its gold reserves. In September 1939, Britain held approximately $2 billion in gold, roughly $45 billion in today's money. By the end of 1940, nearly all of it was gone. Shipped across the Atlantic in secret convoys, loaded onto American docks, and deposited into the Federal Reserve. But gold wasn't enough. Not even close. The Treasury turned next to Britain's overseas investments. For over a century, British investors had accumulated assets around the world, railways in Argentina, rubber plantations in Malaya, factories in Canada, oil fields in the Middle East. This portfolio was worth an estimated $4.5 billion, perhaps $100 billion in modern terms. It represented generations of accumulated imperial wealth. The American government demanded Britain sell these assets, and not at fair market value. These were fire sales, conducted under wartime pressure, with buyers who knew Britain had no choice. American investors purchased British-owned companies at 30, 40, sometimes 50% below their actual worth. Consider Viscose Company, a British-owned textile manufacturer operating in the United States. Before the war, it was valued at over $100 million. The British government was forced to sell it for $54 million. American Viscose Corporation, as it was renamed, would go on to generate profits for American shareholders for decades. This pattern repeated across hundreds of transactions. British assets in America were systematically transferred to American ownership at bargain prices. And still it wasn't enough. By December 1940, the Treasury reported a horrifying number to Churchill. Britain had less than $2 billion in convertible assets remaining. At current spending rates, they would be completely bankrupt within weeks. The war was barely a year old, and the world's greatest empire was broke. This was the moment Churchill wrote that letter. 4,000 words of carefully crafted desperation. He told Roosevelt about the shipping losses in the Atlantic, the bombardment of British cities, the urgent need for destroyers and aircraft. And then he came to the point. The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. Churchill was telling the President of the United States that Britain could no longer afford to survive. He was asking Roosevelt to find another way. And Roosevelt did find another way. But here's what they don't teach you in the history books. The solution that saved Britain in 1941 contained hidden clauses that would destroy British power within a generation. On December 17th, Roosevelt held a press conference. He introduced a concept he'd been developing with his Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau. America wouldn't sell weapons to Britain anymore. Instead, America would lend them. Roosevelt used a homespun analogy. "Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire," he said. "If he can take my garden hose and connect it up to his hydrant, I may help him put out the fire. Now, what do? I don't say to him, 'Neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it.' No, I don't want $15. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over." It sounded reasonable, generous even. Lend-Lease, as it became known, would provide Britain with weapons, food, and raw materials without immediate payment. Britain would settle accounts after the war. Churchill called it the most unsordid act in the history of any nation. He was wrong. It was, in fact, one of the most calculated acts of economic statecraft ever conceived. Buried within the Lend-Lease agreement was Article 7. Most histories barely mention it. But this single clause would prove more destructive to British power than any German bomb. Article 7 required Britain to work toward the elimination of discriminatory treatment in international commerce and the reduction of trade barriers. In plain English, this meant dismantling imperial preference, the system of tariffs that bound the British Empire together economically. Think of it this way. The British Empire functioned as a closed trading system. Canada sold wheat to Britain at preferential rates. India exported textiles within the empire duty-free. Australia sent wool and meat to the mother country at below-market prices. This system kept imperial wealth circulating within imperial boundaries. Article 7 was designed to blow that system apart. American corporations wanted access to empire markets. American farmers wanted to sell food to British colonies without facing tariffs. American manufacturers wanted a level playing field. Roosevelt wasn't just lending Britain a garden hose. He was demanding the keys to Britain's house once the fire was out. But there was more. In August 1941, Churchill met Roosevelt aboard warships in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. They issued a joint declaration that would later be called the Atlantic Charter. It sounded noble, a statement of shared principles for the post-war world. Self-determination for all peoples. Free access to trade and raw materials. No territorial aggrandizement. Churchill later claimed he believed these principles applied only to European nations under Nazi occupation. But Roosevelt had other ideas. American officials made clear that self-determination meant exactly what it said. Including for India. Including for Africa. Including for every colony flying the British flag. The price of American support wasn't measured only in dollars. It was measured in empire. Now let's talk about the precise financial mechanics of what happened next. Because the numbers tell a story that no politician on either side wanted to admit publicly. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States provided approximately $31.4 billion in Lend-Lease aid to Britain. In today's money, that's roughly $650 billion. An almost incomprehensible sum. But what did Britain give in return? First, there was reverse Lend-Lease, goods and services Britain provided to American forces stationed in the UK. This totaled approximately $6.8 billion, or about 22% of what America provided to Britain. Then there were the strategic concessions. In 1940, before Lend-Lease even began, Britain agreed to the Destroyers for Bases deal. 50 obsolete American destroyers in exchange for 99-year leases on military bases in British territories from Newfoundland to the Caribbean. America acquired strategic real estate across the Atlantic. Britain got 50 ships that were already heading for the scrap yard. But the most significant wealth transfer happened at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. In July 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel to design the post-war financial system. In theory, this was a negotiation among allies. In practice, it was a coronation. The American dollar would become the world's reserve currency. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank would be headquartered in Washington, not London. The pound sterling, which had dominated global finance for over a century, would be permanently subordinated to the dollar. John Maynard Keynes led the British delegation. He proposed an alternative system, an international clearing union with a neutral reserve currency. It would have preserved some balance between American and British financial power. The Americans rejected it completely. Here is the brutal truth. In 1939, London was the financial capital of the world. By 1945, it was a satellite of Washington. The pound would spend the next several decades in managed decline, lurching from crisis to crisis, devaluation to devaluation. The dollar reigned supreme, and Britain was only beginning to pay the price. When the war ended in August 1945, Britain's celebration was brief. The country was victorious but devastated. Bombing had destroyed or damaged 4 million homes. Food rationing would continue until 1954. The national debt had reached 250% of GDP, a level that would take generations to reduce. And then America sent the bill. President Truman terminated Lend-Lease immediately upon Japan's surrender. There would be no gradual wind down, no adjustment period. Britain suddenly had to pay cash for supplies already in transit. The British government, desperate for dollars, negotiated a massive loan. In December 1945, the United States agreed to lend Britain $3.75 billion. Canada added another $1.25 billion. The terms seemed reasonable, 2% interest repayment over 50 years. But there were conditions. Britain had to ratify the Bretton Woods Agreement. Britain had to make the pound sterling freely convertible to dollars within 1 year. And Britain had to continue dismantling imperial preference. The convertibility requirement proved catastrophic. When Britain opened the pound to free exchange in July 1947, there was an immediate run on sterling. Investors and traders rushed to convert pounds to dollars. Within 6 weeks, Britain burned through almost the entire American loan trying to defend the currency. The government was forced to suspend convertibility in humiliation. The empire began hemorrhaging. India gained independence in 1947. Palestine became an ungovernable nightmare, and Britain withdrew in 1948. The African colonies would follow within 2 decades. But perhaps nothing illustrated Britain's diminished status more clearly than the Suez Crisis of 1956. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France launched a military intervention to seize it back. The operation was succeeding militarily. British and French forces were advancing. And then the phone rang. The Eisenhower administration was furious that Britain had acted without American approval. The Treasury Department began selling British pound holdings, triggering a currency crisis. The Federal Reserve refused to support sterling. The International Monetary Fund, controlled by American votes, threatened to deny Britain emergency credit. Within days, British forces withdrew. The message was clear. Britain could no longer act as a great power without American permission. The financial leverage established during World War II was now being used as a weapon. Prime Minister Anthony Eden suffered a nervous breakdown. The British public was forced to confront a devastating reality. The empire was over. Britain was now a medium-sized European nation dependent on American goodwill. Here's one final detail that most histories omit entirely. Britain continued paying its World War II debts to the United States until 2006. The final payment of $83 million was transferred 61 years after victory. Think about that. British taxpayers were still paying for the war when their grandchildren were entering university. The debt outlasted the Soviet Union. It outlasted 11 American presidents. Children born the year the war ended were collecting their pensions before Britain finished paying for American help. So what are we left with? The standard narrative says America saved Britain in World War II. That's true. Without American supplies, Britain would almost certainly have been defeated or forced into a negotiated peace with Hitler. Lend-Lease kept Britain fighting. American soldiers, sailors, and airmen died liberating Europe alongside their British allies. But the financial reality is more complicated. America didn't save Britain out of charity. It saved Britain on terms that guaranteed American dominance for the next century. The dollar replaced the pound. American corporations gained access to imperial markets. The military bases acquired in 1940 still host American forces today. Winston Churchill's desperate letter in December 1940 saved his country from Nazi conquest. It also began the final chapter of British imperial history. The money that kept Britain fighting came with strings attached. Strings that slowly, systematically, irreversibly pulled the empire apart. In less than 5 years, Britain went from being the world's greatest imperial power to being America's junior partner. The total value of British assets liquidated, sold, or surrendered during the war has been estimated at over $30 billion in 1945 terms, roughly $500 billion today. Churchill was right that Britain would never surrender to Hitler. But what he couldn't say publicly, what perhaps he couldn't admit even to himself, was that victory would require surrendering something almost as precious. Not to an enemy, but to a friend. The empire on which the sun never set would be paid for with the empire itself. Today, we still see echoes of these decisions. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency. American military bases still dot the territories once painted imperial red. And Britain still debates its place in the world, caught between European integration and an Atlantic alliance born in the desperation of 1940. The untold stories of empire continue to shape our present in ways we rarely acknowledge. Understanding them isn't about assigning blame. It's about recognizing that the world we live in today was purchased, quite literally, with decisions made in wartime under pressure with consequences no one fully understood. Follow the money, and history reveals its secrets.